This space changes so fast. And so maintain flexibility with everything that you're doing, because you're going to change your mind with certain things because the market forces you to do that at certain times.
Hello friends, Jess here from C Club. Welcome to Season 3 of Building at the Edges. We host conversations with the top innovators, thinkers, and builders at the intersection of crypto and community. I'm excited to bring you this conversation with Justin Alanis, who is a co-founder at StoryDAO. StoryDAO is taking the Hollywood model, but making it Web3. We spent time talking about intellectual property and what needs to be in place to actually create decentralized IP. We talk about the complexity around building a decentralized storytelling product. What are the guardrails? What are the structures? What are the approaches that allow a bunch of human beings on the internet to come together and co-create something that maybe one day could rival Marvel? We get into the specific steps StoryDAO is taking to build and define this new category. So let's get into it. Justin, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me, buddy. Stoked
to have this conversation. I've given us a bit of an introduction here. I would love just to hear from your mouth. Like, who are you? What are you working on? And I think more importantly, like, how did you get into this space? Because I have a window into a little bit of it, but I know there's much more to be shared there.
How I got into space, I sold my last technology company and had the time, flexibility, freedom to explore new curiosities and new opportunities. And my cousin was in the Web3 crypto space, started an amazing company in the space. And I called him up. I said, how do I get involved? And he introduced me to the crew at Metacartel Ventures. And it's one of the earliest venture DAOs, which is where I met you, and built a network there, started to meet entrepreneurs like yourself, and started to get exposed to new ideas, new opportunities, new frameworks. Became totally obsessed with the idea of crypto and Web3 disrupting so much of what we see as cracks in society today with new access, ownership, and collaboration models. And then I got on a call with a guy named Jess Sloss at C Club. And and all of a sudden, like, it felt like everything kind of clicked. It was this, I'd heard a lot about social tokens, but didn't really understand what they were and what their purpose would be. That seemed to coincide really beautifully with the idea of DAOs and the formation of DAOs and the expansion of DAOs, as well as NFTs. And so I wanted to get involved in the C Club ecosystem. So I just started attending meetings with you guys and started seeing what you guys were up to. And I became fascinated with the idea of building in this space as well. Now I'm here and starting to build in the space as well.
Yeah, I love it. I totally forgot that we met through Metacartel and you were sort of like their representative in our conversations. And then how quickly, it's like one of my joys is to see somebody new that I have met kind of get exposed to C Club and then just like fall hard down the rabbit hole, as they say. And you fell hard down and then we're a wonderful early collaborator with us. So thank you for all your support.
Thanks for everything you guys did for me and for the ecosystem. Just being in those meetings, talking about things like tokenomics and the accelerator and seeing the projects that are coming through Seed Club, it was super eye-opening for me to start to understand what people are doing in terms of at the earliest stages of formation of these companies.
Yeah, I feel like there's still such a opaqueness. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think just, part of that, as we were talking about earlier, is just like the lack of clarity in it. Then there's legal stuff. Then there's like, a whole bunch of assumptions that people make and bring to the table when they think about, what might work in the space, et cetera. And so all those things, I think, pile up. And we see that with so many of our early stage builders being like, I need to get this right. How do I get this right? And I think one of the things I also love about C Club is how we can just sort of like start to peel those things back, lay them on the table. It isn't as big a barrier to actually get in and build. But, you've sort of transitioned into going after a very large market segment, large opportunity, something that has even more, like we were talking beforehand, reviewing some of the bullet points that we came up with here. I'm like, I don't know if I have actually a strong opinion on most of these sort of things, which means to me like there's just this whole exploration space that still exists and that hopefully we can sort of dive into here. But why don't you introduce like what StoryDAO is and maybe the dynamics of the market that you're stepping into? Because I think it is, everybody has had exposure to this, but I don't think a lot of people have sort of thought through the behind the scenes and what's going on there.
Yeah, happy to. And on what you said last, I think that the reason for the name of this podcast, Building at the Edges, is exactly what we're doing. We're building at the edges. We're exploring new and untapped territory with new technologies and trying to understand what the power of those technologies can deliver to builders like ourselves. And that's super awesome. It's amazing to be able to do that, right? To be able to satiate your curiosity by going and working with other people who have similar interests and seeing what the possibilities of this new technology are, it has been amazing. And so StoryDAO is an IP incubation hub. It's a platform for new IP to be born with community at its core, is essentially how we think about it. We partner with A-list Hollywood creators at least we're starting there, to start new universes, narrative-based universes to start, but it's really, think of it as a multimedia storytelling platform where you can tell new stories in all forms of different media and people can consume it in all forms of different media. We think that writing and script writing is not the best way to engage audience. Scripts kind of suck to review and to read. And so how do you create and incubate new ideas, new stories with new voices? And that's really at the center of our mission, is to empower new creatives with this model. And so we're partnering with these existing established Hollywood creators and partnering them with existing established visual artists, creating new universes. And we're creating a platform to be able to tell these stories in new ways. But then I think one of the beautiful things about what we're doing is that we're trying to bring community into this at its core. We're telling these stories in a super immersive way. So the NFTs, or what we're calling story moments, become these experiences within the storytelling process where people can be actually immersed in the story itself. You can become almost a participant in the story. We think that's a new way that Web3 can enable new storytelling models, one of the ways. And then in addition to that, we're inviting creatives from all around the world to open up these stories with us and to expand on these stories and to create new fan art and fan fiction and user-generated content around these stories, all with a shared treasury that is used and governed by the central creators and the NFT holders to be able to expand the intellectual property for each narrative universe. And so we're partnering with A-list Hollywood creators to do it. We're also going to have community-based projects. And we're also going to work with established IP that exists out there to bring new community, whether that's reinvigorating dormant IP with established studios or existing NFT IP and bringing story and community around those existing pieces of intellectual property.
So I hear this term IP thrown around quite a bit, and it means like a bunch of things to different people. Intellectual property, obviously, but I think it is like this core mechanism or building block of Hollywood. We've all probably heard these pitches or ideas of like, we're going to go build the Disney of Web3. And it's this sort of like, or the Marvel of Web3, right? You can sort of see like the end result of what a valuable, powerful IP franchise is, worth billions of dollars, the Star Wars, the temple strategies, all these sort of things. I think what's maybe, again, try to pull back the layers here a little bit. What does IP mean in the context of Hollywood? And tell us a little bit about sort of like the business structures. Why is IP valuable, and how is that value currently created or distributed in like the Web 2, as we like to call it, world in Hollywood?
If you think about some of these brands, like you talked about, Star Wars, they started as a movie, and you ask yourself, what is Star Wars today? It's not a movie. It's not just a movie, at least. There's a component of the movie being a piece of it. It's part of a theme park. It's experiences. It's merch. It's characters. It's all sorts of video games. It's experiences, all sorts of different ways that you can experience the intellectual property. And so the way that we think about intellectual property is it's really the basis for all sorts of different ways to monetize in the future, whether that be movies, TV shows, video games, merch, all sorts of different ways and mechanisms. And so when today in Hollywood, people are thinking about IP, they're thinking about creating stories and the characters associated with those stories. And they're typically building those through scripts, as I talked about earlier. And they're going and they're selling those scripts to a distributor, mostly Netflix, Amazon, who control most of the rails of the system. They control the funding rails and they control the distribution rails of the system. And that creates an environment where these creators are today getting squeezed on both the back end and also upfront. They're getting maybe paid a little bit more upfront, but they're not able to see the residual revenue for their creations in the long term in all the different ways and manifestations for how this initial piece of intellectual property, this story, these characters can be monetized. And so that creates a whole host of problems in the traditional Hollywood world today. And this is all coming to a head today, all the while production budgets are inflating. And as a result of that, you're starting to see that studios and distributors are starting to put more money into what they call sure bets. So the idea here is that if you can start to create the kernel of that IP, of that story, and bring community around that story, start to create this sense of shared ownership and collaboration around that story, that ignites in a low-cost way this intellectual property in which a studio and somebody who wants to create premium IP down the road can have more assurances and feel more confident in putting a big production budget towards something like this, in that they can feel confident that there's a community already around it and there's going to be some fervor towards it. And you're seeing this today with some things like, novels is like the traditional way that you see this today. There's some other things. Video games start to be an incubation of IP as well, although they're very expensive. And so this is what we're thinking of as like a true incubation of IP.
Yeah, it's interesting how the model of Hollywood today is one of sure bets, right? It's why you see 47 Marvels or 52 different Star Wars movies, and the rom-coms of the late 90s, early 2000s just don't sort of exist anymore. And maybe, I don't know if I lament the loss of rom-coms, but there's definitely like almost like a big gap in between the independents and that world that still sort of exists and maybe gets distribution on Netflix and like the large IP or brands, and then sort of this mixture in between. And so the thesis here is basically, people want to de-risk it, right? The reason why they're not going to go make huge investments into these big movies or even video games, et cetera, is because it is a huge cost to put in, increasing cost. And, if there isn't sort of proven consumer demand there, if people are actually going to go out and experience these things, then it feels like a much more risky bet. And in fact, they'd much rather pay a ton of money to buy existing IP, because at least they know that there'll be sort of some enduring revenue opportunity from there, and it will get people into theaters or to go buy things. So, okay, so that checks out. Do you see parallels here with like user-generated content and journalism and Substack, in that there's sort of like, it's the ability of an individual or of a brand to be able to actually drive eyeballs ultimately is the valuable thing. And that's, if you have millions of Twitter followers, you're probably going to get a book deal, and you're probably going to be able to get a job at the New York Times if you want it. But if you don't have that, you kind of don't.
Absolutely. You're starting to see it with fan fiction communities out there like Wattpad or Radish. You see it with Substack and Patreon. People want to start owning the relationship with their fans or their community directly and being able to monetize directly. I think the unique element of what Web3 offers, though, is collective engagement, whereas what you see with those brands today, Patreon or Substack, is that you have individual engagement. UGC on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram, it's really a singular voice, and people react to that singular voice and they support that singular voice. But there's not a lot of ways to collaborate together and share ownership over something that you create together today. And ultimately, that's really the unlock that we feel Web3 uniquely accesses for us, is that now you have the opportunity for a creator who has this original idea. And we very much believe in still the role of the auteur, the visionary, the George Lucases of the world, to take the Star Wars analogy to the next level. But then also the ability for new voices to come in and add new wrinkles, new elements to those stories, and actually share the ownership of those stories as a result of this new paradigm and this new technology.
All right, I love it. So, okay, it's a good sort of segue into the how of this, because I think as you sort of alluded to there, like so many of these major franchises were the brainchild of some creative genius who sort of maybe by both their creativity and then some luck were able to like make a thing, and it, George Lucas or George R.R. Martin, or, these are like some of the biggest franchises have come off the back of, in many cases, one individual. And so when I start to think about this idea of decentralized IP creation, I start to think about all the challenges that we have in flat hierarchies, the chaos of an open Discord, the fact that probably not everybody is a creative genius, and therefore the value of contributions that are going to be all over the place. So I'm curious, like, I'm assuming you have a more narrow point of view on like how to structure decentralized IP creation in a way that is actually going to lead to some success. And so, yeah, I'm very curious about the approach you're taking.
There's a lot to this whole question, I think, but I'll start by saying that if you look at Hollywood today, you have these centralized visionaries who kickstart projects, but very seldomly do they actually take the project through to completion. George Lucas is a great example. He oversaw the first three, but there were so many people that were involved in those productions. And then Star Wars started being handed over to other creatives from around the world who were established Hollywood players ultimately, but they fell under this studio umbrella in which they handed off this creation, the Star Wars creation, to say, go and take this to the next level, build new stories around it. Marvel's a great example of this, of how it started with comic books originally, ultimately got handed off and took a long time to mature into the intellectual property that it is today. And now Marvel is made by all sorts of different directors and writers and actors. And really, what it leads us to thinking is that Hollywood is just a network of all these people together. It's a network. It happens to exist mostly in Los Angeles, which has certainly its flaws. But as part of this network, you have all these different creatives who participate to create these amazing stories in mass media franchises. And so, as we think about this within the context of StoryDAO, we think that the creation model should mimic what is ultimately happening within Hollywood, where everything and everybody has their role, but it doesn't mean that the centralized auteur is responsible for every single thing that happens. Number one, you have fans who want to be a part of understanding and have a say in how the story unfolds, at least partially, right? Like, you can make an argument that if George Lucas had listened to his fan community for stories 4, 5, and 6, they would never have been made in that way. People wanted something different.
We didn't want Jar Jar Binks. We wanted Jar Jar Binks.
Yeah. Some of it was great, but there were elements of it that I think everybody, or George R. R. Martin's a great example of how it got taken over. And the last season of Game of Thrones, really everybody was super disappointed by it.
Garbage.
And
absolute
everybody
garbage,
wanted,
Justin. It was garbage. I'm so pissed.
That's right. And everybody wanted something different. And if they had leaned into the community a little bit more, basically as thought partners in this, better creations would be made. That's kind of number one. Number two, in order to produce these, Game of Thrones had these centralized creators who were not George R. R. Martin. They took over the script, especially for the last few seasons, and they kind of ran with it. And George R. R. Martin had very little influence and say over the direction of what this would be because those books hadn't been written yet. And so very similarly, today, what we envision within StoryDAO is that you have these centralized creators, but people should be able to have these attachment points, should be able to take backstories and side stories and future stories and new stories that maybe couldn't exist in traditional Hollywood, like this Bridgerton musical, thing that happened on TikTok where these women got sued because they wanted to create a musical around Bridgerton, which is on Netflix, and they're not able to contribute to that intellectual property. And so this solves, I think, a lot of the problems of co-ownership, where today, if you're just a rank and file employee at Pixar and you're creating a character, you don't really actually get to own that character. You don't get to have ownership over that intellectual property today. If you're a fan, you don't get to contribute to these intellectual property universes. In fact, you get sued over it. And so how do you start to solve and bring the creators together in a network and move the distributors and the financial kind of providers of the network to the outskirts and bring this network closer together and divvy up ownership and value of the network to the people who are contributing the value to the network?
So I love that context. And when I think about how do you actually execute on something like that, that's where my mind starts to break, because, you're talking about almost central entity like the IP, or let's just call it a DAO in the center here. And then you have, in the traditional Hollywood model, all these different service providers. And there's very clear mechanisms, compensation guidelines, there's unions, there's all these pieces that, make that machine run. What I'm hearing you say here is you're like, yes, great. There's actually a lot to learn from that, but we're going to rebuild that in a way that actually changes some of these fundamental pieces, mostly around ownership. And then my mind goes like, yeah, but how? Because it seems like this potentially like overwhelming problem set to go after. So maybe what are you trying to do first, or how are you bringing some sanity to that model?
So the way we think about our platform is really two sides to the platform. There's this new distribution model that we have, a new form of storytelling. The new form of storytelling is really this almost like a visual novel. It's for our first production, it's a combination of a lot of narrative podcasting combined with visual art and dynamic visual art as well. And then also we infuse these story moments into the actual production where people are immersed in the story. They're either purchasing or getting NFTs and having those as collectibles, but also represent shared governance over this treasury where they get to determine almost in a nouns DAO style how the money is spent in order and perpetuate the intellectual property for that universe. So StoryDAO is a centralized company today, but we incubate and we launch new DAOs that house each universe, right? So if you took the Disney example, Marvel would be a universe, Star Wars would be a universe, so on and so forth. And so these NFTs represent governance. But then at the StoryDAO level, we really believe in building out this platform to almost be like a social network of creatives, where the back of house of the platform is an opportunity and a place for creatives to come in, to contribute, to answer bounties, to submit proposals, to have free form creativity on the platform, to connect and collaborate, and to establish rewards and incentive systems within the platform so that the content that you're generating, the actions that you're taking on the platform directly then relate to some sort of token share that you get of the overall network in the long term. That's how we're thinking about it today.
Yeah, I think like the big trend that we see as you continue to build out these organizations, it's that like this vision of having broad participation in these organizations is powerful and awesome. And then, where the rubber hits the road, you start to realize, oh, like there's just a lot of context and structure missing, that making it easy and clear for a consumer, somebody who's maybe not deep in the operations of the thing as their full-time thing, to actually participate with value is challenging, and probably requires, I think in my current worldview, building out more application-like experiences that make those guide rails clear. So I guess that's what I'm hearing from you, is you're saying, yes, these things might be big and broad in their general terms, but you're sort of like taking a fairly strong approach and sort of defining the guardrails of how something like this will look, say like the medium and the interaction points and the value points. And I'm assuming the point of that is to sort of enable this more accessible participation in the community.
That's exactly right. Yeah, we think of attachment points as being super critical to any ecosystem. And today, attachment points within DAOs are very hard to understand and participate in because they happen in Discord and Discourse and Snapshot and Twitter and everywhere else. And so,
My
how do you,
DMs.
yeah, your DMs, yeah, exactly. And so, how do you harness all this energy in a scalable way? Well, guess what? Web2 has already solved this. They're called network effects and product-led growth and various product initiatives and alerts and notifications and things like that, right? And so I think that ultimately DAOs and NFTs and tokens are this really amazing fundamental underlying technology that can empower new user behavior, new ownership models, new access models. But the user engagement, or in this case, the community engagement, I don't think it's going to be so different than what we see today in Web2 models. And I think most builders should probably start at least thinking about it that way, because the first version and the first generation of NFT projects relied on hype and just community and very thin IP and crypto Twitter and all the rest of it. And they could kind of operate in this echo chamber. But ultimately, at the end of the day, we only have, I think, like several 100,000 active wallets in the NFT space today, aside from what Reddit's doing, right? And so I think the biggest question for builders today, and that we are thinking about a lot, is how do we onboard the next several million users into Web3? And it's really by abstracting away a lot of the Web3 technology and building a really clean and beautiful product experience for both the network of people who are creating the value and also the people who are the rabid fans or the super fans and the more passive community members that are bound to happen within any network.
Yeah, I think that this idea of disrupting the incumbents is so powerful in this space, and it's a great motivating factor. And also, the likelihood that maybe we're seeing more likelihood here, but there's such strong network effects that exist in projects like Spotify or in YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. It seems like unlikely, at least in the near term, that those will sort of be disrupted by decentralized tools. And so this idea of leveraging, I mean, all of crypto is built on Twitter right now, right? Like if you're not active
100%.
there, you're not sort of in the world. And I definitely don't see that as like a true downside, though there's obviously some trade-offs that exist there. When I start to think about how teams are building, for the masses or for non-crypto native folks or for, Web2 audiences, what I see often is like that these teams are actually making some trade-offs that ultimately devalue the underlying reason for crypto in the first place, right? So I'm curious, like, what are the essential bits here that make you say, like, this is why Web3, this is the non-negotiable part? And then what are the places where you feel like that sort of negotiability around where and how this distribution and action happens?
Absolutely. So for us, one of the biggest pieces of non-negotiable is that the people who create the value for the network need to own the network. Like that's just like a hard stop, non-negotiable for us. In addition to that, we feel that, and that's done through, in our mind, a token eventually. Now, we're not even close to launching a token, and we want true product market fit before we release a token. And so we're thinking about creating a synthetic reward system within our product before we even launch a token to iron out and prove out what the reward incentive system actually is within our platform, and also to ensure that it's working well within the platform and not distract from true product market fit with token go up, right? And it's kind of how we built our initial community as well. We launched this producer token community, which is where also one of our non-negotiables is that we feel NFTs create amazing community around governance and just this shared ethos together. And that's one area where we're really leaning in. And so we created this producer token community. It was our first community. It was 300 people that we hand selected through an application process, which I'm sure we can get into that and why we chose that direction rather than just opening it up to the public. But we felt very strongly that we wanted the right people as the earliest part of our network. And we decided to sell that NFT for very low, zero point 0.1 ETH. But we raised almost $40,000 into a shared treasury that went directly to that community. StoryDAO didn't benefit from any of the proceeds related to that. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create a community of a brain trust around the StoryDAO ecosystem to start. Because we really felt that you start with your core team and then you expand out to a community of creatives that are going to help that core team be successful and distribute it and get the word out there and bring new ideas to the table. And then within each production, we're very much going to mirror how we're doing that, where we're going to be growing our community through NFTs and NFT, these story moments, but we're going to be doing it in a gradual way where we're not just releasing 10,000 at once. And it just becomes this mess again on Twitter and Discord. And you're getting the wrong people as a part of your network. But instead, we're really orienting the incentives in the network towards how do we get the people who we want to be a part of this network early on to become a part of this network. And so those are the pieces that I think are really non-negotiable for us. And then the pieces that are like less Web3 is really from a product-centric perspective. Again, how do you layer in network effects and product-led growth models into a product-led experience? And how do you harness all of this engagement and activity in a way in which it feels very Web 2, so to speak, but has these underlying Web 3 properties of shared ownership and access?
Awesome. We could go down the rabbit hole of StoryDAO, I think, for a long time, because I think there's just like obviously a ton of depth in the thinking behind it. And also I think so much of it is going to be proven out as you sort of, get punched in the face by running your first one, which I think is coming up in the next little while.
Yep.
But you're also sort of, launching this into a world where there's some hot button topics that directly sort of impact the types of businesses that you're building here. And so I think the hot one right now is sort of the royalty debate in the NFT community. Like, should marketplaces accept and continue to perpetuate the royalties requested by creators, or should they go to zero? I think there's a ton of arguments on both sides. Some of them are arguing for it's just inevitability of sort of the race to the bottom. Others are saying like, well, maybe this is a very short-term minded way of approaching things, and really holders should want to have this. And I definitely have opinions on this one, but I'm curious, as somebody who's trying to, you're building right at the nexus of this in many ways with the creators who I think the core, one of the core promises here is not just ownership in the thing, but it's also the ability for you to not just have a sort of, one point of transaction, but that if you're continuing to support the growth of this IP over time, that there's this residual revenue that kind of comes back. So yeah, I'm curious what you're thinking and how you guys are approaching building in this sort of new emerging world.
So the new and emerging world is very much a part of what's just happening in Web3 in general, where you have to be ready to shift and react to what's happening more broadly in the ecosystem. This is with regulation and it's with technological changes as well. And so none of this comes as a surprise, I think, for us. I think, though, my belief just generally is that the beauty of NFTs is that we have these smart contracts that enable this royalty and revenue share to happen organically on the blockchain. And it's one of the really powerful mechanisms of NFTs that are going to spur new points of innovation. Certainly, it's one of the things that we are looking deeply at StoryDAO, because we feel that very much like Nouns, which has a perpetual supply, also the royalties, Bored Ape Yacht Club has made up to $15 million a month in royalties alone. That's a business model in and of itself. I don't think it's necessarily a sustainable business model in and of itself. You have to, as a business, start to think about where are we getting other revenue points other than just NFTs. And we think very much of NFTs as more community attachment points and governance mechanisms rather than just strictly revenue mechanisms. But it would be nice to be able to have these NFTs, if the IP became something super valuable, also become valuable and have a portion of those sales as an exit tax go back to the shared treasury that people could then use to advance and perpetuate that IP and pay the creatives appropriately. Seems to make sense. Now, as a result of this changing landscape, I think there's a number of shifts that creators are going to have to react to. And we're thinking about those actively right now. We don't think that this is going away. Unless Ethereum all of a sudden says, like, we're going to embed this into the Ethereum blockchain in and of itself, like, it ain't happening. There's always going to be these marketplaces out there that are zero fee. And so I think it's really based then on projects to determine what they want to do from a royalty perspective. And there's different enforcement mechanisms that I think that projects will have to wrestle with. One of the things that we're thinking is like, do we want to approach this maybe more as like a freemium model where our NFTs have a lot of value within our ecosystem? And so do we start to strip away some of that value, some of that utility within our ecosystem if somebody buys a non-royalty NFT, for example? And so how do you create these different enforcement mechanisms within your community to enable some of that royalty to become back to your treasury in order to make sure that you have some revenue associated with the NFT volume that your project is earning?
Yeah, I think it's going to be super interesting to see how teams innovate around this, because I agree. I think there's just so many, like, it's not going away. That cat's out of the bag, and it was inevitable all along, I think, in many ways, right? It's just sort of the incentive structure that exists here. And also, I think then it becomes, we are playing games at incentives. And so it's up to projects and builders to figure out how to build new incentives that really start to reward the types of behavior that we think will be valuable for those communities. And I think we see two pretty clear paths that teams are playing with. One is, as you're alluding to, this idea of like being able to indicate good community members follow these rules and therefore get new access, better access, more reputation, etc. And bad community members don't. So, okay, that's a path. That is just one nexus point, in which there's a ton of different creative things you could do around it. And then the second is just really reevaluating what the token model is from day one. We're talking about Nouns here indirectly, but Nouns has a zero royalty fee, and it's because they're fully recognizing the full value of demand at the point of sale of that NFT. And it's perpetually inflating supply. And so, whether that's teams holding back an amount or building one that sort of token structure that continues to inflate or evolve, I think those are interesting. And we'll probably see a mixture of the two. But I think for me, what sort of makes it clear, and I think you just love like the extremes that crypto Twitter gets into around this stuff. It's like it's either this or it's that, and like rarely is it so black and white in life. Ultimately, you have these sort of two distinct groups that are participating. There's people who are participating because for the love and the connection and the belonging and the membership of and the adventure, as we call it at C Club. And then there's people who are speculating, and both of those are valuable. Right. And I think where speculation gets a bad rap, and rightfully so, is when it's just purely speculation. And I think that's what we've seen so much of in the last little while. And I think why we have such a focus on communities, because we think that's a much more sustainable way of creating value and a much more fun place to be in. But highly likely that if somebody's speculating on these assets, they're going to go to an AMM, they're going to go to a SudoSwap or to an FTX or to a Blur or whatever these things are. And then really likely that the people who are really in it for the adventure and the belonging are going to do that through these more vertically integrated marketplaces, or ones that are actually that if I interact here, I am able to purchase something that has the accrued reputation with it or access, or it's the nice color versus the black one from being bought off of like the thing. But I think both those things are valuable. And I think to your point, like I think a creator came to me around the royalty debate really feeling quite flustered by it, because I think the model they had in their head was very much around this. And I'm like, welcome to crypto. Right. And we need to assume that this is just going to continue to evolve and change, because, we don't have to go back 5 years to see major shifts. You can go back 5 months, you can go back 5 weeks in this case to see these major shifts. And so we should just assume that is the world that we will be building in for the foreseeable future.
100% in a free and open network like crypto, where the technology can be repurposed and forked, and you can take open source code and you can reinvent how things are. People are going to be continuously innovating, and we're seeing that actively. But I think, to your point, where the innovation needs to be thought of as like a durable long-term strategy is with this community, right? With your core community, not with the speculators. To your point, there's room for speculators in every single marketplace that happens in crypto, I think. But I think the focus for any builder needs to be on who is their core community member. What do they do? How do they act? What do they want? What motivates them? And I think as a result of that, if you do a good job there, those are actually the ones that probably are going to trade less, because those are the people who have actual value in those NFTs. Whereas the speculators are going to be the ones who are trading it on more of this no fee marketplace. And it's not going to come back to the community, and the speculator is going to make all the proceeds from that. But I think that you can play around with things like supply and inflation and holding back some supply. And there are other innovations that I'm sure are going to arrive as well as a result of it.
Yeah, this is the fun stuff.
Yeah, it is. It's really fun to think about. All of this is super fun because it really, I think, stresses your mental acuity, right? Like of how you're starting to think through problem solving and decision making and leaving flexibility for things to happen within your ecosystem and not locking yourself in a corner. Like one of the biggest lessons I learned early on from some of the builders in the space is like, don't pin yourself in a corner early on at all, because this space changes so fast. And so maintain flexibility with everything that you're doing, because you're going to change your mind with certain things because the market forces you to do that at certain times.
Yeah, I think that's like double underline that. I talk about that in terms of optionality. And I think what makes actually building mechanisms and protocols and products in this space even more challenging than say something like C Club, where it's more of a community level thing, is that you have to make so many trade-offs. You have to start to like truly build in and be very opinionated about things. And, getting that right is a difficult thing in a moving environment like this. And so I think it's one of the best privileges that we have as community builders in this space is that we can have much more optionality. And really, I think when you're talking about the value of community, as much as we like to think about tech and platforms and tools, the core value that's being created in crypto generally is a social value, right? The Bitcoin is valuable because we believe Bitcoin is valuable. And that's makes people feel uncomfortable who are maybe not in the space, but it's probably because they haven't fully dove into why things have been valuable, why money's valuable, why seashells were valuable in the past, right? And so we see
For
that,
sure.
just I think owning that as a core idea. And so that means that I think getting that underlying community, that subculture, that meme correct is the important thing, and where durable value will be created. I love that we're seeing more new language and nuance come out, and that we're seeing projects that are really pushing into this. We can go back to, I think Bitcoin is an original, but I think Dogecoin and Shiba and Nouns, these are all sort of like early slivers looking at this thing. Ethereum, with their hard fork and from the DAO hack, like these are all just examples of this. And I think we're going to continue to see more and more and more. And that's why the space that you're building in is interesting to me, because I think it's not just about IP in this traditional sense. I think it has the potential to be far more culturally defining and expansive. And I don't think we sort of even have the mental frameworks for understanding what the Bitcoin maxi type belief and religious appreciation look like in Hollywood. And I guess you see that in some of these bigger IP pieces that we're talking about. But I think when you sort of like, I heard a DAO being described as like a meme with an institution previously. And I think like, okay, and actually Jacob Horn I think he tweeted like, what would a blockbuster movie with a DAO look like? And you start to get into these like, what is the box that we put that in? I don't really know what the box is, but my intuition is that there's something really interesting and potentially really large starts to come from that.
For sure. I think about the potential often for what this StoryDAO could represent. And today, I think when you look at DAOs, it's hard to imagine a scenario in which a DAO becomes really big or a decentralized company becomes really big. But I think if done in the right way, decentralized businesses can become far bigger than their centralized counterparts, if they even have a centralized counterpart. I think StoryDAO represents a new form of technology and community that Web3 uniquely enables that doesn't have really a corollary in the Web2 world. But you see a lot of these like, Web3 Twitter, Web3, whatever, right? And I think if done right, that these networks can grow to the scale that people never imagined that they could even grow to within the context of a decentralized business. Obviously, a lot of things need to happen, right? We're still in super early days and we're in the infant stages of all of this technology. So all of this right now is really all about experimentation. And I think that some of these businesses will get these pieces of experimentation right and unlock some really important and dynamic effects that we've never seen before in the Web2 world and have these new business models flourish. And networks really, if you look at historically, the networks are the valuable thing. The IP is a byproduct ultimately of the network like that we're creating. For Twitter, it's the content. Same with Instagram and same with TikTok. It's all this UGC that's coming out of these platforms, but it's the network that is creating all the value of this network ultimately. And the output of that is the intellectual property or the content that can be monetized in so many different ways, whether it be through ads or licensing or NFTs.
So I think that thinking through how value will be created in these decentralized networks, let's say like a decentralized IPs out there, and we have a community that's contributing, and there's fan content being created, and all these things are going right. And that gets us to only like part way, I think, in the vision that you're articulating here, because there seems to be, at least in the vision that you have, that there's like a lot of more traditional touch points that IP is going to interact with. Like, merch is going to exist. And I think merch is a massive business model for these brands. Maybe there's a feature length film, maybe there's a video game. How do you sort of see that traditional world that is generating revenue in a traditional sense actually flowing back and touching the owners of this stuff, the token holders, the NFT holders?
Well, we just got off a call with one of the biggest studios right before this. And so very top of mind for us right now in terms of how these folks are thinking about it. I think that right now they're in the discovery phase, right? They're like, we know this is going to be something. What is it going to be? And how do we interact with it? And how do we position ourselves appropriately to make sure that we're not left behind, right? Because I think that everybody saw the disruption that happened with Web 2. And now that Web3 has arrived, everybody's going, okay, we need to be ready for this. We need to be at the forefront of this in order to not be disrupted ourselves. And I think a lot of existing brands out there and existing companies out there, whether it be studios or publishers or whoever, are actually going to get it right. I think that they're going to have some Web3-ness to them. They're going to engage community through new mechanisms and new ways using Web3 technology. I think it's inevitable. I think a lot of people are going to get it really wrong, but I think some brands are going to get it right. And the brands that get it right are going to have new engagement points and new community members and just new ways of having participation and access for folks who never before had that access. And so right now, what we're seeing in the space is that there's really two ways that big studios can participate in this ecosystem, or at least in the StoryDAO ecosystem. Number one, through, as we talked about, licensing our content that we produce. So, we're going to be producing both StoryDAO produced content. We're going to have community-based content, very similar to the way C Club operates, and almost like an accelerator model, where we are supporting community-based projects from zero, using our technology and our rails and our connections and all that. And then we're going to be working with existing intellectual property owners as well. So whether that be NFT brands or dormant IP in Hollywood today. And if you're a studio, for example, and you've got these inflated production budgets, and you want to go and you want to test whether or not a piece of intellectual property is going to resonate with a community, what better way to do that than through something like StoryDAO? That's kind of number one, is coming in, taking their existing intellectual property, whether that be dormant or something that they want to test out, a new piece of intellectual property, and building community around it and starting that process from that point forward. The second is through licensing our content and saying, oh, community is already attached onto this. We want to go and we want to take this production and we want to go make a movie, a TV show. We want to go do something in the premium content space with this because it's already been proven out. So I think both of those things are going to happen within this space. And then there's going to be other ways off StoryDAO platform that existing studios and distributors engage with as well, where we're seeing it with like things like Bad Robot that Netflix has done, where Justin Roiland's doing something with Paradigm around this, where new stories or existing stories are going to leverage NFTs and various other Web3 tech in order to engage audience in a deeper way. And that's not going to be on the StoryDAO platform. We're all about IP incubation and building community around that IP from the start. But existing IP, I think, can leverage this technology in innovative ways to advance the community relationship.
Yeah, I think that the thing that I'm going to be watching most in this space is just where and how we align incentives through all those different groups. And I think it's very top of mind for me when I think about maybe some of the moves that larger NFT collections have done in the last little while, where there's people buying into these NFTs, and then there's a separate equity-based entity that then goes on to raise capital. And it doesn't, I've talked about this on the podcast before, where I think there's a almost like a natural misalignment of incentives that start to emerge there. And maybe it's not 100% visible right away, but it starts to sort of move forward there. And so I think I'm currently of the belief that unless the network is the core and the tokens represent governance in that network and participation in that network, and that everything else is in service to that rather than that being in service to other entities, that we're going to end up in a place where, token holders become consumers and not owners. And we're kind of right back into the same sort of BS that I think we're trying to fight against right now. So like, how are you sitting here so certain that, the model that you're rolling out is actually going to push us in the direction that we're most excited about, rather than devolving back into because there's tons of
Totally.
incentive. Like I get why people why Uniswap would raise a bunch of money into their corporate entity, or why Proof would,
Yep.
or it makes tons of sense. And also, I
Yep.
just worry about the knock-on effects long term.
For sure. I think it all depends on the direction that the creators of the business want to take the business. For us, we've been very clear from the start that we feel really strongly that a centralized business is important early on, to have that force behind what we're doing in order to build the right technology product, to build the right ecosystem, to build the thing, right? We really believe in centralization from that angle. But we've been very clear that eventually we do want to tokenize and we want this to become a public good. I do have concerns over companies like Yuga Labs, for example, who raise at a $5 billion valuation based on the backs of all of this creation that's happening around the Bored Ape Yacht Club NFTs. And none of that revenue, none of that raise is going back into the hands of these creators. And so basically the way I think about it is almost like a franchise model using NFTs, where the centralized company doesn't help the franchisees in any way, shape, or form. And I think that creates a really dangerous precedent, because Yuga Labs will have, I think, a priority to earn a return for its equity stakeholders. And unless they have a vision to tokenize, but they already did through ApeCoin, but like ApeCoin wasn't Yuga tokenizing, it was just like a new currency that was out there in the market that doesn't have a whole lot of utility, but it was their way of, I think, benefiting some of the NFT holders to begin with. But I think that hybrid model, I just don't think it's going to work long term. At least that's our philosophy. I think the corporate entity needs to tokenize. It needs to distribute ownership to the people who are creating the value of the network, and fully align incentives where, we've raised money. We've raised almost $6 million now into the centralized company, but we've been very clear that we've had token warrants with our investors, and that the future of this company is going to be tokenized, and your benefit is going to be through the token rather than through the equity of this business. And we've also been very clear with them of how much of the token we want to ultimately give over to the community in order to make sure that it actually is a public good rather than being controlled by internal shareholders.
I think one of the most clarifying questions to ask an entrepreneur that is sort of building at the early stages and maybe raising into centralized entities, like, what is your exit? Is that exit an IP or an acquisition, or is the exit something to community? And there are very different outcomes that you should start to see, like a lot of breadcrumbs in the early actions that teams are taking. And ultimately, there is still an immense amount of trust that's being put in these things. But I think
100% there has to be.
And as we start to see more of those things, more exit to community happen, and them creating more value. Because I think, we have to assume, at least in my personal belief, it's like, this is not only the right ideologically direct path to take. I mean, it's the reason why I'm in the space generally. I remember participating in early social networks and then being like, feeling rugged by Facebook or YouTube or Google around, your rankings, et cetera. It's just not a good feeling based on the amount of effort you put in. But also, I think there's this driving belief that networks are more valuable than companies. I think, there's a tweet that I always reference from Aaron Wright at Flamingo DAO and Tribute Labs, which is like, DAOs are not companies, DAOs are networks, and networks are more valuable than companies. And I think that will be proven out. But without a doubt, a lot of work to be figured out there. The last sort of point I would love to get your thoughts on, because you're sort of, if we cast our mind's eye back past the last NFT related debate that was royalties to 6 weeks ago, when the hot debate was CCO, and whether an NFT should be CCO, I'm assuming that that's a very relevant thing for the world that you're building and thinking about. So
It is.
I'm curious what your opinion on CCO models are, how you might see those evolving. Is that something that you're going to be playing with at StoryDAO?
Yeah. And real quick to respond to what you said last, like, when Artifact sold to Nike, I had this tweet and I was like, everybody's celebrating Artifact's sale to Nike. And I was like, this is not what we need within Web3. Like, this is not the outcome that we want. Artifact should have tokenized, should have given the value, or at least part of the value to the network, to the people who own the NFTs and were contributing value to the network, rather than Nike. Listen, Nike's awesome. It's cool that they're in the Web3 space, but I just have this underlying ethos that this should be the case. I'm really firm.
I think they would. You're going to look back on it too and see that they lost out on a lot of value creation for doing that.
Totally.
As well.
I thought, I was asking some of our investors, like, how much do they sell for? Like 3 billion. And they were like, dude, not even close. Like a couple $100 million at the most. You look at what their revenue was from just royalties alone at the time. And if you just slapped a 10x multiple on it, that's a $3 billion company. And so they left a lot of money on the table in the height of the bull market, selling to Nike to begin with. And if you look at it on an even longer term horizon, I think that they left even more money on the table by selling to Nike. So I completely agree with you.
Spicy takes. I love it. Let's go.
Get the TikTok reels going. Let's go.
Yeah.
So from a CCO perspective, we do have a lot of thoughts about CC0. They're not fully fortified yet, I would say. We're talking to our community about how we want to move forward from a CC0 standpoint. But I think one of the things that we pretty much believe in fairly firmly is that full open CC0 is not the model that we want to engage in. We see all the innovation that's happening within Bored Ape Yacht Club, for example. It's super cool and amazing. But I think that there are some real downsides to the CC0 model that we haven't fully seen played out yet. I think if that you want to create a Hello Kitty type of environment where there's really thin IP at the top of the ladder or of the value chain, where there's not a lot of story or anything like that, and then you create this franchise model around the NFTs, then it works. But as a company, like what we're doing, we're trying, the whole ethos of our business is to create value around the intellectual property. We don't think it's right that then all of a sudden this community of creatives is creating value around the intellectual property and advancing it and creating new stories and creating new characters. And then all of a sudden somebody can take that NFT, whether it be a brand, let's say Gucci comes in and it's like, okay, now we have this NFT. Now we're going to create a commercial around it. We're going to create a bag around this NFT. A lot of people argue that that value comes back to the community and brand awareness. But for us, because we're dealing with what I'd call fat IP characters and stories and enriching that intellectual property through properties other than just a character, that value should be shared in some way with the community in a real way rather than just brand value. And so we're thinking strongly about some hybrid model where it's more like a community controlled CC0 model, where if you want to commercialize your NFT, you have to prove that you're equipped to do it. Like, like you should come to the community and say, hey, here's who I am. Here's what I want to do with this NFT. Here's how it adds value to the brand. And also, is there a revenue share component of what you're going to commercialize with the community so that the community can also benefit from the value that you're creating with your brand itself? But a lot of problems just generally, like probably 1% of all the NFT holders are going to create anything commercialized. It creates big barriers to entry. Somebody could co-opt your brand. You could have bad actors that take an NFT and create like some Nazi thing around it, or create like the future MAGA, NFT club using your NFTs. Like all of these things are realistic possibilities that we haven't seen play out yet, that I think will eventually play out in a true CC0 model.
I feel compelled to take the opposite side of that argument because I think there's two angles here that I think play out. One, I think in a truly decentralized network, the ability to enforce IP becomes very challenging and problematic, costly, maybe unrealistic. That's maybe not the strongest argument because obviously there's real world entities and you can structure things in a certain way. I think more compelling in my mind is that, we've seen a number of brands launch using Bored Apes or using nouns, and the value there isn't the image. The value there is the community, right? It's the fact that you have the backing and support of this thing. And so I think like the things that will become relevant are the things that are actually good for the community and that the community backs versus those things that are just purely co-opting the brand. In fact, I think the co-opting of a brand would lead to such a negative backlash that it ultimately would seem not a valuable approach to take. Now, I take your points of like, there are edge cases here that very naturally open yourself up to in these ways. And, some creative human being that wants to come in and take advantage of that potential backlash and counterposition around it. Like, well, I'm happy that there is just sort of a diverse set of opinions and approaches to this out in the marketplace and it definitely does have to be contextual. Because I think something like nouns is just such an absolute powerhouse to have CCO behind it. And that model really would be limited in so many ways if it had all these IP controls.
But at the same time, nouns has a 60 ETH floor. And so it's a really hard to access network. And that's more of not a function of their CC0-ness, but it's more of a function of how their supply works within their model. But I'm not sitting here saying I don't like CC0 and I don't see the benefits of CC0. I'm saying that I think that at least the community should have some say in the way that the CC0 ultimately manifests itself.
And I think with regards to Moonbirds and stuff, that was really where the core issue was and what caused this sort of debate. It wasn't should it or shouldn't. It was just the fact that there was sort of like a unilateral decision taken. And I'm a believer that's actually going to play out well for them. Again, if we come back to the idea that the meme is the thing that is valuable and that nobody owns Dogecoin, and that here's my sleeper belief. I think Elon buys Twitter. Twitter rolls out some payment rails and Dogecoin becomes the pament rails of Twitter. Yeah, and the fact that he can just go do that, I think is fascinating.
Utility. Yeah, but that
Sure.
that introduces utility into Doge, right? And I think there are very few concepts. I think we overestimate how many concepts can become like memeified. Ultimately, I think the reversion back to true value is always going to be the thing that I lean on, right? Like if you as a builder are trying to build memification, I get it. You can lean into that, but there needs to be true value within your ecosystem for sure.
Memification and true value. Like, I don't think you can pull those two things apart. And I think there will be billions of memes. We're just going to expand the idea of meme to be beyond this thing
Fair.
that is just breaks through all culture and everybody knows. I think what we're seeing, like I think that the way we're seeing meme used a lot in the space right now is more of like an amalgamation of brand and utility, and like there's this sort of like representation of a subculture. To me, that's where sort of that ultimate value lies, and why I would make the argument
Yep.
that being able to build something that is for and of that subculture is going to be far more valuable than others. And how do we actually remove the friction to go do it? But I do think this
Yeah.
idea of the value is that community is in control of these things. At the very least, it needs to be driven by community. And I think this franchise model is actually, like, we don't talk about it enough in this space. I think the franchising, the idea of using more professional engagement in a network and having that as valuable and as a way of actually creating value for the network, whether that's, Bright Moments and anybody in the world being able to go launch a new Bright Moments gallery, assuming that they own a franchise NFT or a number of those NFTs. I think there's really interesting value flow mechanisms that can be developed around there. And yeah, I think it probably makes a lot of sense that those things start to get proved out in the more pure IP plays that we're seeing here and that you're playing with.
I think for sure. And I think there's also this question of what's the responsibility of call it the centralized entity, right? The Yuga Labs, the Proofs of the world, the StoryDAOs today of the world. What's their responsibility to help these CCO projects function, exist, and thrive? Proof did this through giving a couple $1 million to the CC0 collective in order to incentivize people to go out there and use it. Now, Proof has raised $150 million, both through royalties and upfront sales and through fundraising. And so they gave, I don't even know what's that, less than like 1%, like a 0.5% of their overall proceeds or cash on hand to the community to go do CC0. I'm of the belief that if you're going to go do CC0, that the company behind it needs to support it in a very real way.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think changing the license of your IP or NFT is not a small decision, and it really should be backed up with a lot of conviction. And I think money talks in that case. All fascinating. I mean, again, I think we started off this conversation with me just expressing anxiety around the scale and the complexity of this sort of world that you're sort of stepping into. And I think, I'm sure people have sort of understood through our conversation here just the level of depth and openness I think that you're exploring the space with. So very excited to see the lessons learned, the insights that come from it, the new mechanisms and ways and that emerge from it. So is there a way for people to get involved in StoryDAO today? How do they go about doing that? Give us your best shill here, Justin, for those who've listened to us for an hour talk about this weird stuff.
Yeah, so StoryDAO is launching its first production in the new year. Right at the beginning of the new year, we're in the production process now with a couple of amazing creators who we're really excited about. And we're creating this new universe, and we're announcing that within the next probably 2-3 weeks. Probably by the time you put this out there, it'll be right around the corner. And so keep an eye out for us. Follow us on Twitter at StoryDAO XYZ. Get involved in our Discord, come into our Discord. And as I mentioned earlier, we have this producer token holder community right now. One of the things I left out is that we purposefully made that NFT non-transferable to start. We didn't want to deal with the speculative environment. We wanted to get the right people in. And so it's not transferable yet, but we are actively talking as a community right now about how we open up new membership for that NFT community and what model it's going to take. So that's an active discussion. So my guess is that we'll open back up membership at some point fairly soon here, because we've had so many applications since we closed it of amazingly qualified people who want to be a part of that community. But even if you're not a part of that community, come into our Discord, go to all the skill shares that we're doing that are led by our head of community, Taufik Khalad, who is a former writer on Barry and Atlanta and is a super creative and amazing human. We also have a person named Laika O'Brien, who was the former head of experience design at Meow Wolf, who is leading a ton of our interactive and immersive sessions. So we're doing movie watches together. We're doing skill shares. We're featuring community members who are doing skill shares. And so we're doing all these like really cool community events right now. And we're also organizing our producer token community into guilds. and starting to do work, which is really amazing and fun.
That was a great chill, Justin. Lots in there.
Thanks.
Appreciate you hanging out with us today and sort of giving a window into seeing how people are sort of like, there's this general belief that this space is going to be huge. And much in the same way, I think people see Web3 gaming as being huge. Though Web3 gaming, I think, is a little further advanced, and you're seeing, large bets being made on what the defining project is in the space. I think what's so exciting about this space right now is that it's anybody's guess what the thing that really emerges from it as being like the thing. It's very clear as you talk to people that the Hollywood, the decentralized IP, the storytelling, like these new world building opportunities exist, but people are like, I don't exactly know where it is. From my point of view, that is the most exciting time to be a part of these communities. You can actually get in, have your hands, get dirty on the ground floor and be a part of, the big adventure of hopefully defining a new category. So if you're intrigued by this, StoryDAO.xyz is the home place for it. Appreciate your time, Justin. Always a pleasure. And thanks for all your help with us at C Club.
Thanks, Jess.
Hello, friends. Steph here, Media Team Steward at C Club. If you like this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review Building at the Edges. This helps other Web3 builders discover these valuable insights. And tell us what you think on Twitter. Tag us at CClubHQ. Thanks for listening. See you on the internet.